Does this game have a story mode or?
A story mode?
Yeah, because I'm seeing like all these emails and calendars. I'm like, I thought this was just about PC building.
Um,
There's
that
like a career mode in the game, but there is also like free building stuff. I just
Oh, I see.
enjoy the career mode thing a bit more.
Okay.
okay. So in career mode, what does that have? Is it the career of a PC technician then? What that's kind of interesting.
Basically, you just kind of like start off like buying your, I think it's like uncle's PC repair shop, and then people just like email you jobs and stuff, and you just do them, and then they pay you, and then you use that money to like upgrade the shop, buy more parts for other jobs, which makes you more money, and just so on and so forth.
That's cool. Yeah. I'm glad I haven't had a chance to play with it yet, but I'm glad I downloaded it when it was free the other day. Well, the other day, a few weeks ago, when somebody mentioned it, I was like, okay, cool. So it was on, it was at Epic Games.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Epic.
So I think it's normally like $20, but yeah, I'm glad you guys pointed out that it was free. So a few of you got it at least. So that's cool. Yeah, very cool. So I'm got this computer plugged in here, and as I recall, yeah, it's let's see if it's got some issues for sure, and we may not get too far in the troubleshooting. We'll take a look at it today here. So got a few more people dinging in, so that's good. All right, so I'll go ahead and share this screen. So Brandon, thanks for sharing. That's it. Yeah. So actually today, while that was up there, you were looking at like power supply and the inside of the case. That's kind of similar to what I've got set up on the desk here. And we'll take a look at this for a little while today. And the main so the problem I was having with it was that I was not getting video, like all of a sudden not getting video from the computer. So I remember now that I pulled the video card out. So in terms of like troubleshooting and stuff like that, one of the things, you know, for me at least, when you're troubleshooting a computer, that getting something on the screen is pretty critical, right? Like, you know, you guys were just looking at the virtual PC and you could see, you know, settings and stuff like that. So my first question for you guys, this is just sort of a general question, but just to see where we're at. If you were troubleshooting a computer, or if you're like bench testing hardware, let's say you've got a motherboard and, you know, either it's been stripped down and you just got a motherboard, can you see, like, if you apply power to it, so let's say you've got a power supply, and like that's kind of what I've got. I'll share the other screen here. So on the desk here, I'll move this around so you can see where the numbers right. Okay, so so on this particular computer, maybe turn it outside. It's plugged in right now. The power supply has a light on it, so you can turn the light on and off. I'll also show you guys how to use a multimeter real quick too, just to do basic troubleshooting. But my question for you guys is, if I plug this thing in, now there's no hard drive in it. And if I take if you just have a motherboard and you power it up, will you see the BIOS or BIOS/UEFI? You guys know what a BIOS screen looks like, right? So like if you power up a computer and there's no hard drive attached, you should see the BIOS screen, yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Now, if I have just a motherboard, so this one has a CPU in it. If I have just a motherboard with a CPU in it, will you see the BIOS screen as well? If there's no RAM in it, like let's say there's no RAM, if it's just a motherboard and let's say you've got a CPU attached to it, or even no CPU, will you see BIOS screen at that point?
With the CPU or no CPU?
Let's say it has a CPU in it, but there's no RAM in it. So you've got it. Let's say it's in. So like this computer right here has a power supply. It's got an optical drive, which I'll slide out the front so you can see stuff a little bit easier in there. So I just pulled out the power, or the optical drive. So this case is kind of hard to see down into. So underneath the power supply is the motherboard and all that stuff. So let's say it's got, and it does have RAM in it right now, but if I pull the RAM out, can you bench test a computer with no RAM in it? I guess is the short story.
No, I don't think so.
Do we have any kind of consensus on that? What would you see on the screen if you didn't have any RAM in it?
I don't think you would see anything.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing, just because it doesn't have anywhere for anything to go.
Okay. So just to kind of clarify, so if you have, if the BIOS itself, the UEFI is built into the motherboard, there's a chip in the motherboard. This motherboard has onboard video as well. So it has a video output, which is what I'm plugged into right now. So if I turn it around this way, you can see on the back of the motherboard, it is running right now. There's no hard drive in it, but this is powered up. This switch, all it does is turn this light on and off, but you can see with the light on that it does actually have power going somewhere. This is a DVI cable, so this is the back plane for the motherboard. There is no video card in the PCI slot. But yes, to clarify there, those of you that answered in the affirmative, in order to bench test or to get something out of the screen, I need RAM in the system. And it does have sticks of RAM in it. However, I'm getting a whole lot of nothing from the monitor that's over attached to it. So like if I've got the monitor just kind of loose here, not getting anything on the screen for the monitor. So we're going to do some additional troubleshooting here. So I'm going to power the thing down. So we're going to, if you guys, I'll move this out of the way so I can see what's going on the screen right now. Well, actually, the first thing we might want to check. So yes, the light is coming on, but most power supplies don't have a light on it. I mean, if you're just working in like general desktop machines, Dells, whatever, the light thing is kind of just, one of those gamer kind of deals. It happened to come on and I most of the time had it turned off anyway. So, but that'll indicate that we are getting some power. The other indication you might use is that internally, if you start, if you push the power button and you try to start up a computer, the fan on the CPU might start spinning, right? If you had some sort of heat sink or whatever. This one's difficult to tell on that because it's got liquid cooling. So it's a little bit harder to kind of see what's going on from that perspective. It's also just hard to see down in there, period. But so the first thing we might do would be to, I've got my multimeter there. If you guys can see the multimeter in the screen, these come in all different shapes and sizes. This is kind of a heavy duty one. You can buy them that are quite cheap, that are, 10, 15 bucks for a multimeter. To test basic voltage, alternating current. So the first click is AC, second click is DC, and then it's got a range button so you can kind of move where the decimal place is. So I'm going to set it so you guys can see it there, hopefully on the screen. So, all right. Then you've got these two probes here. These are pretty handy to have just to kind of do some basic testing. Power supplies are typically putting out two ranges of voltage. So you've got 12 volts and 5 volts coming out of your typical power supply, right? So it puts out, so it's taking the wall current, the AC wall current from your house, and the power supply's got a pretty tough job to do. What it's doing is it's taking alternating current and it's converting that to direct current. DC is what, laptops, computers are all running on direct current. Direct current is the same type of current that would come off a battery. So like a car battery is DC. There's no alternating waveform pattern to it. It's just all consistent, like a car is 12 volts. So on the connector here that I've got, this is an extra 6-pin connector. So I've got a black wire, a red wire, yellow wire. One of these is not connected. So the red wire here and the black wire is ground. So you can see I'm getting 5.11 volts. Okay, so it is putting out power. If I put it onto the yellow wire and then any of the black wires, I'm getting 12 volts. Okay, so this particular connector puts out both voltages for connection to things like video cards, stuff like that. It is not currently being used in the system, but it is able to be putting out power. Typically, your black wires are ground wires. So in this case, I don't need to have, it'll ground out to any of the other wires that are the black wires. So the other plug there, this one's empty. It's hard to see in the little, that one's empty. This one's a ground wire. That one's a ground wire. I can zoom this in closer a little bit. Hope you're able to see that. So easy to do, easy enough to see, okay, any of the black wires there, and then push it over to the 12 volts. Now, if you have a power supply that's outside of the computer, so like, let's say you've got a box of parts, you've got a power supply that's just sitting there. I'm going to unplug this computer, so I'm not going to be in danger of damaging components, right? So I'm going to unplug the computer, pushing the power button on the front of it to kind of dissipate any possible electricity. And digging down inside here, I probably should take the power supply, slide it out of there, but I'm going to dig in here and see if I can get this out of there. Wrestle that out of there. So it's got a clip on it. I just need to undo it. There it is. All right, so it's a little hard to get to. Okay, so here is our 20-pin connector and then an extra 4-pin. So it's a total of 24 pins. With this particular power supply, this extra 4-pin connector can be slid off. You can see I've almost got it off there. So it basically, on some, it's actually taped on there too. So on some of them, it's a 24-pin connector that's all molded together. On a lot of them, it's a 20-pin connector and then an extra 4-pin connector on the side that may or may not be used depending on the system board, on the motherboard. On this one, it does obviously is used. Okay, so what I was going to show you is if you've just got a power supply and it is outside of the computer, because remember that in order for the power supply to kick on, my power switch that's on the front of the computer goes to the motherboard. There's a little pin that, or a little plug that connects to the motherboard in there somewhere. It's on the left-hand side down in there. So it's right in that area, if you can see it. This is where you've got a reset switch, the power, hard drive LED. These can be one of the most frustrating things.
Just gonna say that's literally the least fun you will ever have.
If you are building a computer, that's one of the more frustrating items because there are these, each one. Now, why in the world they didn't at some point make these into a single molded connector that's all, you know, so I'd have power switch, reset switch, hard drive LED, the speaker connector, all those could be molded into one connector easily, but instead you've got this mismatch, and most of them are just simply you're bridging two connectors. So you could flip the reset switch around backwards and it would still work. It just has to connect those two pins. So at any rate, the power switch connects there as well. So the power switch, when you push the button on the front of the computer, it's sending a signal through the motherboard, and then it sends a signal through this 24-pin connector and the green wire on here. So you can see on the back, you've got a green wire. The green wire and one of the black wires get connected, and then that is a switch. That switch is on the switch that's inside the power supply. So if I'm trying to bench test this, so pretend for a moment that, get that out of there. That is for, oh, it's an extra connector for the dealer. All right, so I probably should have brought in a computer that was bigger. The case was bigger. This one's fairly compact, but it needed to be having troubleshot. Is that a word? It needed to be troubleshot because it's not working, and it would be nice if it was working. It may in fact be the motherboard. My very initial testing is not getting any video. I remember pulling the video card out of this thing, and that didn't do anything for me. I do have an extra video card that I could put into this slot right here to test it. So anyway, long story short, if you were going to test a power supply and you did not have it hooked up to a case, right? This over here, not that anybody's looking too much at both sides of this, but if you wanted to see a different view here, got this going on. All right, so if you're playing around with this stuff and you're wanting to troubleshoot, you would connect here is my fancy tool I made. Any old paper clip. This one's a pretty heavy duty paper clip, but it doesn't, all you're doing is creating an artificial switch. Now they do have they do have tester tools for this, like a little tester that you can, so I'm going to plug the power supply back in. It is not currently plugged into the motherboard. You know, the 24 pin connector is not plugged into the motherboard. So I'm going to plug that in. And I should have actually got a paper clip that's smaller. This one's pretty heavy duty. Here's a better one.
It's too thick.
Yes, this paper clip is super heavy duty. It's too fat to fit in the little hole. So I'm going to use a wimpier paper clip. And like I said, we do have some of these little tools around too that are a power supply tester tool, but oftentimes you don't have one of those, but what you do have is a paper clip. So we'll go into this hole here. And then the black wire, of course, one of the black wires.
Is that something you should look at, like the schematics of a power supply, just in case? Like you said, usually.
Yes, if you were being smart about it. Now, there is only one green wire, however, so it's pretty tough to mess this up. There's only one green wire. You can look up the schematics of it. And in fact, usually I have students look up the schematics of these wiring diagrams, and it'll say, you know, give you a pin number as well. But really what you're looking for is the green wire and any of the black wires. Because remember, it's a common ground. So any of the black wires, and you can see that it is in fact lit up again. This one gives us a nice visual since it's got this light on the back of it. So we're powering up the power supply at this point. So if you needed to test a power supply and it wasn't in a computer where you could be pushing the power button and having it go through the motherboard and give you a signal, this is a quick way to power it up. So I can leave that paper clip in there. And then of course I could go in and do my, you know, signal check again on this thing. Now, typically power supplies will fail catastrophically and you'll get all or nothing, right? So it's not too common that I would get power out of this connector and not have power through some other connector, right? So I can also test the 24 pin connector here. So I've got red wires here, and these are a little fat too to fit in there. And then another black wire. Oops, hard to reach. There's one. Okay, so I'm getting 5 volts out of this connector. Again, power supplies put out a combination of 5 volts and 12 volts. Now you'll notice that CPUs, oftentimes you're only using like 1.35 or 3 volts. You know, CPUs are using a lot less voltage than that. So that's another function of the motherboard, is to have a step down resistor on it to give you the proper voltage for certain components in the motherboard itself. So things like the CPU that's running at much reduced voltage, that's another feature of the motherboard. But basically, I can see at this point that the power supply is working. I'm still not sure what's wrong with the computer. I mean, it isn't getting any video. I've powered it up. There's nothing coming through the onboard video. I've got this monitor that's kind of sitting here, right? It's kind of flat, laying down flat. But yeah, a whole lot of nothing out of the video componentry. I'm gonna, at this point, power down. So so I can test this out. So some power supplies, what I was getting to is some power supplies do have 2 rails. There is a common rail system, and then they have 2 components that are putting out. So I guess theoretically, some of the gaming power supplies, you could have one of the 12 volt rail fail, and one would still be putting out power, but typically not very common. Usually what happens with these power supplies is that the fan oftentimes will fail, and then stuff just starts getting hot, right? You know, like if you don't have a fan running that's supposed to be cooling it off. One other quick thing to mention, this is it's a 630 watt power supply. There's a section in your book where it's talking about, you know, what components add up to whatever wattage. There are power supply calculators online as well. I typically go bigger than I need. The book recommends, I think it's like 30% over what you think it'll need. But the other thing to keep in mind is that this is 630 watts. It doesn't mean that it's pulling 630 watts from the wall all the time. It's able to put out that much, but it's not pulling 630 24/7, right? It's only putting out. So you can buy a bigger power supply than you really need, but then cost becomes an issue. Like there's no reason to put a 1,000 watt power supply in this little tiny computer. But so there's definitely a trade-off there. The book has some recommendations. For the purposes of your quiz that you guys are working on, just go with the book's recommendations. You know, add up the components that it's got, give it the 30% overhead. One little toy I was going to show you guys too. This is kind of a handy toy. This thing, you can get the light glare off of it. This is called a kilowatt. You can use these for other components in the house. Like if you're curious how much your refrigerator is pulling, or a computer or whatever, you just plug it into the wall, and then you plug your component into it, whatever that happens to be. And you can actually set it to watts, amps, volts. So typically you're thinking about watts as a measurement of how much power a unit is drawing. So like a household electrical heater might draw up to 1500 watts, right? That's the maximum wattage for a household heat, plug-in wall heater. So at any rate, these Dell computers we've got in the classroom now, not counting the monitor, although you could plug the whole power strip into one of these things. We were really surprised at how little wattage they actually use. They're pretty efficient. They're not gaming computers by any means. But, and then we started running some stuff that was, stressing the system a little bit more, and they would pull a little bit more wattage, but they were running under 200 watts easily. So you're not pulling a lot of wattage. Now, a big gaming computer with 2 video cards and everything else plugged in, I'd be curious to see, how much it's actually pulling from the wall. But keep that in mind. This is a 630 watt power supply, but that doesn't mean it's pulling 630 from the wall all the time. It's not going to ramp up to that. Okay, so where was I? I was going to, again, pull the power plug on this thing quickly, and we'll do a little bit more troubleshooting. Okay, so actually, I'll ask you guys, right now I've got it, I had it plugged in. I'm gonna unplug it again, take my paper clip out here. I'm gonna put the 24-pin connector, it's a little hard to get to, back into the motherboard. So we'll have power going to the system board again, hopefully. Why I didn't bring a bigger computer to play with, that would be a good thing to do. There it goes. All right. So I've got that powered back in this, and then while I'm in here, I'm going to check the RAM to make sure it's seated a little bit. I was supposed to ask you guys too, though, but that's a good thing to check, because we just discussed that without RAM, I'm probably not going to get video, right? And that was the main problem, is that the video wasn't working. It's possible. So is it possible that the RAM is bad? What do you guys think?
That's possible.
Okay. Will it boot with 1 stick of RAM? I mean, will it power up the display through will 1 stick of RAM work, or does it need 2?
If you have it in the right slot, right?
I'm asking you guys.
Yeah, it will.
Yeah. All right. So it has both sticks in it. I did press on them with my thumbs to kind of, and I'm not sure, maybe it was my imagination. One maybe felt like it was a tiny bit loose. I don't know. So let's try this again. It's powered up, or I will plug it back in. Okay. So if you guys can see on the screen there, I've got that. I'll move this around a little bit. So the other thing I have laying out here, this is an extra video card. This is an older GeForce 750 Ti. These are actually a pretty decent card, or were a decent card for the money. I mean, they're kind of at this point, they're getting a little older. The other advantage that these 750 Ti's have is that they're fairly power efficient. Notice that it does not have any facility to plug in extra power connectors. There's no extra 6-pin PCI 6 connector needed. So that's kind of nice too. So if you had an older computer at the time, or like these Dell computers in the classroom, the power supply did not have, on those Dells, did not have these extra power connectors to power video cards. So we use those as well. So so that would be the next step, is to maybe put that video card in the slot. But we should be getting video from the onboard video, right? It's plugged into the DVI connector. I think everything's connected that way. If you can see the source button here, I've clicked on that. It's connected to the DVI connector through the input source on the monitor. So let's
Does
power
it-
this thing up. What's that?
Does it give you a beep or anything?
I don't know that it has a speaker hooked up. That's a good question. Some motherboards have a built-in little tiny beeper speaker. I don't believe, that's a very good question. I don't believe that this case has an onboard speaker, and I don't know that the motherboard has it. So what you're asking about is like for the post codes and the beeping.
Yeah, it's like if it's no video, then it backtracks to.
Yeah, and then sometimes it'll go beep, beep, beep if it's like bad RAM or something like that. All right, so I'm going to power this thing up. And getting a light back there, but still, as you can see, no video coming out of this thing.
Where does the PC come from again?
Pardon me?
Where did that PC come from again?
Oh, this is my personal one from home. Yeah, so this is one I'd built a few years back. My daughter used it for a while in her room as kind of a gaming / kid computer. That's part of the reason that I built it in kind of a small case like this, is that she didn't have a lot of room on her desk and didn't need the big giant case with the flames and the smoke machine and stuff. So I built it kind of a small compact computer, and it quit working last year. And what I did is I was kind of in a hurry, did some basic troubleshooting, and then didn't want to mess with it anymore. So I pulled the solid state drive out of it and put the solid state into another computer, because this was the one that I was using when I was teaching from home every once in a while, and I needed to be working right away. So I was able to boot up the solid state in another system, and then just kind of set this one by the wayside. And it's got some halfway decent components, so it would be nice to get it working again. But so far, not having much luck today with the.
Is there any through your experience? It's really hard for me to tell, like, oh, how do you know if a motherboard went out or is shorting and it's not screwed in properly, or if it didn't get seated? Maybe.
Yeah, the motherboard is difficult to troubleshoot. So like I said, today we're running into that issue where, this one I'm pretty sure is not grounding out on the back. So that's another thought. If you were bench testing a computer and you had a motherboard sitting out, that wasn't mounted into a case, they do say, definitely don't have it sitting on top of static bags, or, because those conduct electricity. So you don't want a piece of what looks like plastic, but it's really not. It's, those metallic static bags will ground out the back of a motherboard. So you'd want to put it on a cardboard box, or ideally mount it into a computer. And then these are the little metal standoffs. If you can see where my finger is a little bit, so you'd want to make sure that the standoffs are in the proper location, and that you don't have one that's inadvertently touching the back of the motherboard and causing it to have an issue or ground out. So I know this one's mounted properly, is obviously and that's the joke, is that everything works until it doesn't. So I don't know how many times I've had somebody say, yeah, my computer was working great until yesterday. What happened, right? Well, stuff just happens, and it just depends on when that happens, So something obviously happened to this. It could very well be the motherboard. The motherboard could have had an issue. So I'm going to take so what I'm getting right now is the power button is flashing slowly. It is powering. It's getting power because the light is on the back of the board there. So I'm going to unplug it again and push the power button to dissipate any little remaining electricity. They recommend that. I don't, again, it's not a huge issue, but definitely do what you can. I'm going to take out one of the sticks of RAM. So we've got this, decent RAM. It's a Crucial memory module, nothing too fancy. They make RAM with lights on it now too. So if you're buying RAM and you want it to light up, they have little like LED lights along the top edge of the RAM module.
Which is kind of cool, because that shielding is a heat sink too. But
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to try first the RAM, first module in the first slot. So again, it's hard to see down in there.
Do you think it's possible that cockroaches got to it because I know they're attracted to heat, and I know sometimes they pee on the motherboards and they short it that way.
That's possible. This computer case was pretty well sealed up before I started taking it apart. You know, that's how that you've heard the term bug in the system, or the systems have bugs. Ironically enough, that's how that saying first started. It wasn't cockroaches, it were moths though. Moths would get into old computers sometimes and short things out. I don't think that that's the case with this one, but I haven't seen too many
I just
cockroaches.
know it's possible.
It's possible, yeah.
Funny, that's something I just never really connected. Like,
Yeah, you know, and in cars, you know, mice will chew on wiring harnesses in cars and stuff like that. So in terms of wiring in general, it's possible you'd look for maybe wires that are broken or shorting out or having issues, something like that. I don't see any. I've when I worked a long time ago for this place that did repairs, you know, people would bring in computers and they brought one in that had a mouse nest in it. There were no mice in the computer, but there was a mouse nest. They were able to get through an open backplane and had made a little nest inside the computer. It was really gross. So, alrighty, so I'm going to try it with 1 stick of RAM in it, this thing, and see what happens. And we may not get, you know, we may not get a resolution today for this thing. Okay, so it's powering up. We're trying to. It would be nice, as Kyle mentioned, if I got beeps going here for this. There's not getting any signal from, this is telling me there's no signal from the DVI cord on it. And I don't get that reassurance of, you know, if I'm looking down inside there, of seeing the fans that are spinning on the power supply. I'm not seeing, you know, because it's liquid cooled, so you're not seeing that fan kick on. And that's another visual indicator, because sometimes when there's a problem with a system, if it's got a problem with the RAM or something like that, you'll see the fan kick on for about half a second to 2 seconds and then shut down again. So like if a system's powering up very briefly and then shutting down, that can indicate other problems with, you know, either the power supply or the RAM or something to that effect. But with this one, it's a little bit difficult to tell, since it's a pump that's on top of that. It's not a fan. So, all right.
and the fans on the radiator are spinning and kick on and all that
Let's see here. That's a
in the
good
front.
Yeah, that's a good question. And that may not come on until it gets to be a certain temperature either. So that's, yeah, I'm not, the fan is not coming on the radiator on the front of this thing either. So that's also maybe not a good sign.
Right, that kind of puts my mind maybe or focus maybe on the CPU potentially.
It could be, yeah. At this point, I'm not, you know, I don't have a good answer for this thing, what's going on with it. It could be the power supply, but we're, you know, I tested it, it is putting out voltage, but in getting the, you know, the power button is just blinking every once in a while. So it is giving some weird signal there. So troubleshooting can be frustrating, you know, if you're working on something and you're trying to figure it out, what's, you know, what's going on with it. Next thing we're going to try is to put an actual video card in here, but I'm not sure that that's really going to be the issue either. So at this point, I could start taking, if I have another computer that's similar vintage. So now yeah, I could start taking some components out and testing it in another computer. So like if I had RAM from another system, I could plug the RAM in from another computer and kind of like start crossing over some components that way. Or if I thought it might be the power supply is not working properly or not getting proper signaling, I could swap out the power supply from another computer. So it does help to have some parts that are cross compatible. So if you're working on the job at kind of like a, you know, IT kind of place or classroom environment where you've got extra computers that are the same, that's really useful to be able to have 2 or 3 of the same computer or a backup to do some testing that way. So yeah, it's not powering up the fan on the front of the computer at all. Which again, this is hooked up to the radiator on it, and it may not. So the other thing too, with testing of the power supply, if you're testing a power supply and this one does have a light, but let's say it doesn't have a light and the fan doesn't come on, don't assume that the power supply isn't working. A lot of the power supplies are eco-friendly, green power supplies, and the fan doesn't kick on until it gets up to a certain temperature. So when the first times I was playing with one of those, I installed it and I thought, and then I didn't think it was coming on. I was like, darn it, it's got, but then eventually I looked on it and it was like, okay, yeah, it was a Corsair power supply with an eco-friendly, and yeah, it has to get pretty darn warm before the fan kicks on some of these power supplies because they're going for it being quiet as well. So not having the fan cause a lot of issues that way. All right, so I'm going to pull the power again. I'll try the RAM in the other slot just for fun. I don't think that's the issue, but okay. And while I've got the lid off now, typically you don't want to do two things at once. So I'm kind of violating one of those rules, that shotgun approach where you're doing two things at the same time. I'm also going to install the video card at this point. And this mounts into the side of the case here. And normally there would be two little set screws to hold this into the backplane connector. I'm just going to leave those out for right now. This had a video card in it that again scavenged for that other system. It had a 960. I forget which video card it was. It's a halfway decent video card. This one's just an extra one I had kicking around. It's not the same video card that was in it. So we'll see. And then I'll change the onboard video to the video card. So the other thing I could do is to start, and it's pretty well stripped down at this point. There is not a hard drive connected to it. It's only got one stick of RAM in the system. Didn't have a video card originally. So they call that the strip down approach. You take a computer and you kind of reduce it to its component pieces and you make it as simple as possible. I'm reading in the chat a little bit. Yes, you need the integrated smoke machines are always good. Yeah, lights, LED lights, all good stuff. That's all right. Minimize that. Okay, so at this point, I'm kind of running out of options for this machine. It could, in fact, be the motherboard. The system board is one of the last things, or it's a difficult thing to try to troubleshoot because replacing it may or may not be an option depending on, like, I don't have another motherboard that would fit into this particular case. In terms of testing the other components, I can test the video card. I could test the RAM in another system if I had one that was, similar. I think this is DDR. What is this RAM here? Hold up the light. 1600 megahertz. I believe this is DDR3 memory. It might be DDR4. It doesn't say on here specifically. So, all right, so we're going to give this a try. I've got the video card hooked up here on the back plane. I'm going to grab the power connector. So some of the other questions you had on your quiz were things like power adapters. So for instance, this is a SATA power adapter. So for powering up things like hard drives, etc. This power supply doesn't have too many of the older style connectors, the Molex connectors. I'm looking to see if it even has one. Usually they have at least one. So it's got plenty of SATA power connectors. Now, also, this is a non-modular power supply in the sense that all the cables that came with it are attached to the power supply. They have modular and semi-modular. And semi-modular would have some of the cables attached permanently, like the ones that go to the motherboard, which you always need. And then others would just have a plug on the back. So if you needed the cable, you'd plug in a cable to it. those are so modular and semi-modular don't necessarily have all the cables attached to the power supply unless you need them. The downside to those is that you have to store them somewhere, right? You know, when you're not using them, if you think you might need them later, you have to put them somewhere and remember where they are. They also tend to be a little more expensive. The downside, especially in a computer this small, is that I have a bunch of cables inside of here that are not currently being used. So they're taking up space inside the computer. Some of them I can, these are kind of nice, is that they've got, you know, an attachment to it. So it's kind of modular in the sense, but instead of having plugs there, I've got these that can be taken off and, you know, removed if you weren't using them. But at any rate, SATA power connectors are, I was looking for a Molex. The Molex are the older style that look like, and this is a question on your test as well. So the older Molex connectors are a 4-pin connector that is, you know, straight up 12 volts. I thought I had something here that had Molex on it. It was an old hard drive, but on my messy desk. There we go. All right, so if you see a connector that looks like that, these 4-pin connectors, those are pretty common on older hard drives, CDs, DVD players, stuff like that. And you can, and if your power supply has a Molex connector, you're probably not using it for anything else. You can put an adapter on it. So you can do Molex to SATA or Molex to, you know, some other type of connector. If you don't have the appropriate connectors on your power supply, there are adapters for that. As long as you're not exceeding the total wattage that the power supply is designed for in the first place. All right, so power this thing on. I honestly don't think this is going to work. I think it might be a problem with the system board, the way this thing kind of failed on me. So
I'm thinking, you know, like the it was the 4-pin, the CPU power, feel like that's all seated well, probably.
Right.
That's pretty hard to get out, but
and one good sign is the fan. If you, it's hard to see, I'll turn it sideways. The fan on the, oops, it just stopped. Okay, so something's going on where it's intermittent. So the fan on the video card is spinning and then it stopped. Let's see. No, I'm still not getting video. And the fan is now spinning down on the video card. So I'm not sure if now it's spinning back up again. So I'm getting some weird intermittent on, off, which can indicate other problems. It's not overheating because this thing's not running long enough to, you know, to generate any kind of heat where it would be power cycling due to the heat of the CPU or something. So it's possible that it's the power supply, or, but I'm guessing that it might be. Here I'm gonna unplug it again. Now it's gotten even harder to get in there. So because I don't have a good spot to store it, I'm just going to put the RAM back in the computer to make sure that it's not. So again, this RAM, it's only going to go in one direction. It's keyed, so you can see it's got a slot right there. That slot is off center by quite a bit. So you have to make sure that you've got, you know, obviously putting it in the right direction. It won't go in the wrong direction. And so you don't want to force it, obviously, but okay. All right. So I'm running out of options. I can Google a little bit. If you were Googling something like, you know, power supply kicks on and off, it's definitely intermittent at this point, which indicates that signaling is coming from the motherboard that's turning on the power supply briefly. And then something is shutting down because the fan on the video card is intermittent as well. It's coming on for a period of time and then shutting itself off. That's not a good sign. Also, while we're at it, on the back of the, one thing to check, which is kind of unusual, it doesn't usually happen. So it's got an on-off switch here as well. They don't all have on-off switches, but you know, if something's not working, you can make sure that the on-off switch on the power supply is in the proper location. So this is essentially binary too, right? 0 is off and the little 1 is on. So make sure that's on. The other thing to check, and if you ever want to play a really bad joke on somebody, is, I'll unplug this before I start messing with stuff. So if you see this little switch here, that's labeled 110 and 220. So if I take that and switch it to the 220 side, your computer will not boot. And it'll take somebody a long time to figure out that the switch was switched, because normally this switch is not something that would get switched at all. So it's on the 110, there's 220. And these power supplies are modular that way because the same power supply would be sold in Europe. And then the power cord would just be a different power cord to go into the wall outlet in a European location. So I mentioned this to my nephew one time, and he switched this little switch on one of these computers, and it took me a long time to figure it out. It was like the little rat, you know, so like, so yeah, bad joke if you're trying to play that joke on somebody, is to switch the wattage on their power supply. So yeah, it's whatever's visible. So that's 220. There's the 110. Make sure I don't leave it in the wrong position, cause myself a headache. All right. So I've got both sticks of RAM in it at this point. Something is definitely intermittent because the power supply light, or excuse me, not the power light on the front switch is intermittent. And although it's spinning right now, the video card is going to probably power down in a second, and the fan will go off on the video card. So in terms of any successful troubleshooting, it's still spinning right now. But any ideas from you guys?
This is like one way that you know it's not the CPU is that like if the CPU was bad, it wouldn't even like turn on at all, right?
Well, I think so that would I would have to Google that. I think that you can power up a motherboard with no CPU in it, but it needs RAM in it too. But that's a good question. So CPU, and also CPUs typically don't go bad. RAM doesn't typically go bad either. Well, for that matter, motherboards don't very often. So this is kind of an unusual one. If I had another power supply to test with, I might just start taking stuff apart and putting it, test another power supply. Sure, not getting video. It's still spinning, so just not getting anything out of it. So it could be that the main board, the system board, is having a problem. So can you bench test a motherboard without a CPU? That's a good question. I don't know that I've ever tried it. Okay, so here is the answer to our question. So it says if we, and if it's on the internet, it has to be true, right? So, says there's nothing wrong with testing your motherboard without the CPU. The only thing you have to keep in mind is that your CPU or your PC will not pass the post. You will see nothing displayed on your screen as well because the motherboard does not have an onboard graphics processing unit. Well, ours does have onboard, but a lot of those rely on the CPU to feed the onboard graphics. So we do have a CPU installed. I don't think that the CPU is bad, but again, that's just sort of a general thought. They don't often go bad, but it's possible. If the computer was subjected to, a power surge or something like that, it could have gotten some bad components going. Yeah. Okay. So the other question that was benched, or so the other question we had was about RAM, right? Can you bench test a motherboard without RAM? So it's basically you have to have RAM in it. It would be nice if it had a beeper. That's true. If it had a beep code, that would tell us maybe something. Now, the beep codes aren't universal, but it would tell us that it's doing something. The one thing that I am suspicious of is, if you guys can't see it now, not sharing the screen, but the light that's associated with the power button on the front of this thing is flashing. It's not staying like on. Like if you normally turn something on, the power button light would just stay on, but this one is not. So obviously it's got some other issues. So you've got a reset switch and the power button. So All right, well, I'm about stumped on this one in terms of trying to figure out what else might be going wrong with it. I was going to start maybe taking it apart. I'll see if I have another power supply kicking around here. If not, I've got another computer at home that I can bring in, and it's similar vintage, I think, that I can start swapping some parts off of and see if it's see what the problem is. So make sure the video card's working, swap power supplies, stuff like that. So, all right, what else we got in the chat here?
Dave, I was reading about hives and like the register keys and like how the operation, I can't pronounce that word, but how the operating system builds up on itself. So what we're trying to do is just literally just get to the BIOS, right? So then it's not trying to get to the bootable because we don't have a hard drive.
Yeah, all I want to see at this point is video on the screen. Like if you're troubleshooting a computer, that's one of the first things. And that's what makes this one difficult to troubleshoot is we're not getting any UEFI, any BIOS information. Yeah, a bigger hammer, Peyton is suggesting, some percussive maintenance. Yes. And then the question on the chat too, I don't remember it being in any kind of weird power outage or anything like that, or a surge. I typically have the computers on a surge suppressor at home. And one thing that's nice about our area is that we don't typically have brownouts and blackouts or power surges. For a period of time, I lived in Indiana when my wife was going to school, and Southern Indiana, we would get these crazy thunderstorms, and also the power wasn't real stable. So sometimes you get low voltage, where they call it a brownout, where your power would kind of like low, and that really affects things like electronics and stuff like that. So we're fairly lucky in this area that we have consistent, fairly stable power. But anyway, to answer your question, I don't think it was in a major power outage or had a surge or something like that, but something's definitely going on with it. So, all right, we're running out of time though, actually, for today. So I appreciate sticking with me on this. Even though I was hoping it would be successful and we'd see something on the screen, I had my doubts because that was what was wrong with this computer in the first place, is that all of a sudden it appeared that it wasn't booting. I didn't get any video on the screen. And at that point, then you're really stuck. You're trying to get to the BIOS screen. If you boot up a computer, even with no hard drive, you should see something on the screen. You should see the BIOS will come up, or the UEFI, and it should actually get past that. And it'll usually say no bootable device found, right? If it gets to that point, because this does not have a hard drive in it. So I should see something on the screen, but we're not getting any of that. So it's difficult to get past.
Use the command prompt at that point, or does that require the CPU too?
You need a CPU for the command prompt. It'll say, so all you're going to see is anything that's generated from the UEFI, from the BIOS. So you'll see, it's looking, you'll see a BIOS screen if you want to get into that. If you just let it try to continue booting, it's going to look for its boot order. It's going to look for a hard drive, USB, whatever's in the boot order. And if nothing's plugged into the computer, it's just going to say, oh, you don't have anything to boot off of, no bootable device found, or something to that effect. But that message is generated by the BIOS, by the UEFI. So. All right, you guys, we're flat out of time. So again, tomorrow is Veterans Day, but we don't have Zoom class tomorrow anyway. Your other classes won't have a class if you have an in-person class or another Zoom session. So get your homework done, be keeping an eye on Canvas. You got a couple things that are kind of hanging out there, and we'll meet back on Monday. Have a great weekend.